Bligh is a complex man who has had his character somewhat sullied through the novels of Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall, as well as the two Hollywood tellings of these two famous novelists' version of the tale. However, the truth behind the life of this extraordinary seaman can only be determined through going back in detail through his family background and career. I have therefore determined to go through original source material, including logbooks, letters and first-hand accounts, to help explain the true facts behind his life. It is a far more interesting than the fiction that has developed, and it is interesting to see quite how many mistakes have crept into the tale, even amongst purported experts, and how his character was even being vilified back in the early 19th century by the likes of John Barrow and the Hayward family, and most notably Lady Diana Belcher. This episode sets about establishing how he came to rise to the rank of Commander of the Bounty. That tale, its famous mutiny, and the successful second Breadfruit voyage shall follow in the next episode, while his later career and the rise to the rank of Vice Admiral of the Blue will form the final part. William Bligh was born on the 9th of September 1754, around 1 o'clock in the morning, and was baptised at St Andrew's Church in Plymouth on the 4th of October 1754. The unusual long gap between Bligh's birth and his baptism has long led to speculation that he was actually born in the Cornish parish of St Tudi, some 39 miles away. The Bligh ancestral family was located at the manor of Tinton in St Tudi, and Bligh's father, Francis, had been born there in 1721. Indeed, Bligh himself states in later life that he hailed from this small village and was a proud Cornishman. Bligh's grandfather has a memorial still visible on the outside wall of the church to this day. What is certain is that William's father was serving as a customs officer in the busy naval port of Plymouth, and that Bligh hailed from a well-connected military family with two elder cousins, Richard Rodney Bligh and John Bligh, acting as senior naval officers, and an earlier ancestor, an army general. The common misconception that William was not a gentleman can therefore be quickly dismissed. Bligh's mother, Jane Pierce, whose maiden name had been Balsam, was a widow when she had married Francis in St Andrew's Church, Plymouth, on the 3rd of November 1753. William was the couple's only child, although he had an older stepsister, Catherine, from his mother's former marriage, who was herself to marry a ship's surgeon, John Bond. It was through the Bond family connection that Bligh looks likely to have earned his first posting in the Navy in the final year of the 7 Years' War against France, as John Bond was serving on the Plymouth-based ship of the line HMS Monmouth. Monmouth was an elderly 64-gun third-rate that had been launched in Plymouth Dockyard back in 1742. The ship is most famous for capturing the French battleship, the 80-gun Foudroyant, in 1758. In July 1762, the Monmouth was fitting out in Devonport Dockyard at the start of her commission. Monmouth's captain at the time, according to the logbook that commences on the very day Bligh signs aboard, the 1st of July 1762, was a Captain John Storr, Esquire. Captain Storr was an experienced commander, having made post back in 1748. He had commanded the 70-gun HMS Revenge at both the battles of Cartagena and with Admiral Hawke at the daring victory at Quiberon Bay. He was to die a Rear Admiral in 1783, and his memorial you see here is in Westminster Abbey. Some commentators, notably George Mackiness, claim that Bligh's first captain was his father's close friend Keith Stewart. However, Stewart was not to come into William's life until much later on. This is one of many mistakes both scholars and historical novelists have made with regards William Bligh's life. It is these errors over time that make it somewhat of a challenge to establish the true picture, a factor made even more difficult thanks to the loss of archive documents in Plymouth during the Blitz of the Second World War. One thing is certain: it was either through Francis Bligh's customs connections or through his stepbrother-in-law, Monmouth's surgeon, that young William earned his first appointment aboard the Monmouth. Bligh is signed aboard as a captain's servant, while the ship is lashed alongside a hulk in the Hamozer off Plymouth. The first day's account reads, "Light airs with rain employed getting the beer on board the Mary Galley, moored alongside, overhauling the blocks and rigging, unrigged the foremast, got out the upper quarterdeck and forecastle guns, and received on board fresh beef." The ship's master's log also still exists. It gives us another account of William's first day, signed aboard a vessel. John Wilson, the master, writes, "At 1 p.m. was punished a man from the Marmaid with 12 lashes for desertion." This is likely to have been a flogging around the fleet, a terrible punishment, similar to that seen at the start of the 1935 MGM Mutiny on the Bounty film. There is no mention of a young servant joining the ship in either account. On the 16th of August, Captain Storr is replaced temporarily by Captain Sir Charles Sexton, who joins the ship when the vessel is assigned to the Brest blockade and proceeds to sea. It is this change of commander that makes me believe that Bligh's stepsister's husband was controlling the appointment rather than the captain. It may even be that young William, at just 8 years old, was never actually on board the Monmouth, although other than for visits to the ship when she was in port. The crew muster book certainly seems to name several captain's servants, and it was a common perk for a ship's captain to sign boys of close connections on board to boost their pay. The 7 Years' War came to an end in February 1763, and with it the Monmouth was paid off at Chatham Dockyard on the 21st of February. Whether on board or not, at the end of the commission, young William had achieved 6 months' valuable sea time on his record. That would contribute to his time served when it came to his examination to gain a lieutenant's commission. The last page of both the Master John Wilson's and Captain John Storr's log book reads, "At 7 a.m. the commissioners came on board to pay off the ship's crew." The war was at an end, and peace made gaining sea time in the much slimmed down navy somewhat difficult. William's name next appears shortly after the death of his mother, when he is signed aboard the snow-rigged sloop of war HMS Hunter on the 27th of July 1770. He joins as an able seaman and is just 15 years old, although, as you see on the crew muster, the book states he appears to be 20. You see the plan for the Hunter's sister ship, HMS Viper. She was lightly armed with 10 6-pounder guns. Launched in 1756 at Deptford Dockyard, the ship had been designed by Sir Thomas Slade of HMS Victory fame. She was the lead ship in her class, and at 237 tons and 88 feet 8 inches on deck was similar in size to Bligh's later command, the Bounty. His commander was Captain John Henshaw. The captain's log on the day he joins states that Hunter is entering Plymouth Sound from the Lizard. The entry reads, "Light breezes and clear. At 7 a.m. spoke with His Majesty's ship Lively out on a cruise. At 8 a.m. hoisted the signal for a pilot, and at 9 saluted the Admiral with 13 guns, which was returned. At noon, all fast, alongside the Edinburgh hulk in the Hammazar." It would have been here that Bligh steps on board with his gear. Despite his rank, William will have been housed with the other young gentlemen on board, and receives his promotion to midshipman on the 4th of February 1771, once again while mauled off Plymouth. The able seaman ranking was a common ruse used by ship's captains to take on more trainee officers than the ship was entitled to carry. This was to repay favours to friends or those who could provide interest to him ashore. The time still counted as sea time on Bligh's record. The sloop Hunter was operating in the Irish Sea and off the west coast of Scotland, and may have been connected to the customs service, preventing smuggling that was rife at the time following the introduction of new taxes on luxury goods to pay for the war against France. It was, of course, these same taxes that would largely lead to the disaffection of the American colonies. Again, we see the connection of Bligh's father as helping his position. Gaining any sort of naval posting during peacetime needed good connections. We have the ship's log book from 5th of August 1770. The first page shows the vessel moored off the Hammazar off Plymouth, preparing for sea. She heads off to Liverpool, where she seems to spend the majority of her commission, with calls to Dublin, Bangor, Falmouth, the Isles of Scilly and Carrickfergus. The final page of the logbook, dated the 5th of September 1771, shows the ship entering Plymouth Sound once again. Bligh is leaving the ship at the end of her commission. The wait for his next ship is to be very short. On the 22nd of September 1771, young William moves on to what must have been a plum peacetime posting as he joins the elegant 32-gun, 12-pounder frigate HMS Crescent. This captured French prize had been built as Le Rostin in 1757 and captured the following year by the 70-gun HMS Essex. We have the logbooks written by the ship's captain for this commission. The entry for the 22nd of September shows the vessel has been moored in Plymouth Sound for 3 days. Fresh breezes and cloudy with rain. On PM took on board bread and 16 hogsheads of beer, and returned 1 puncheon and 2 hogsheads empty. Received some boatswain's and carpenter's stores. Also received 1,166 pounds of fresh beef. Cleared hawse and sailed for the Caribbean. Just prior to this call in Plymouth, the frigate had undergone a refit at Sheerness Dockyard. This refit had cost £3,964 and 18 shillings, and was her first docking period since her middling repair at the same dockyard back in 1763. You see her deck plans here, the only Admiralty plan for the vessel which survives. The gunroom or midshipman's mess will have been behind canvas screens between the wardroom and the crew mess area. Privacy will have been limited, and there was little ventilation below in the dark, with no gun ports to allow light or fresh air. 32-gun frigates were fine sailing vessels, particularly those designed in France, and even in peacetime the West Indies posting could potentially offer rapid promotion. Here are some prints from French sailing instructions showing a 32-gun frigate like the Crescent. The ship sailed for the Leeward Islands, calling at Tenerife and Barbados en route, before arriving off Antigua on the 15th of November. The Crescent was under the command of Captain John Corner. He seems to have been a very talented hydrographer, and the National Archive has some documents relating to Crescent's time in the Caribbean. The 29th of December saw an embarrassing call to Puerto Rico, where the ship ran aground after losing an anchor. Refloated a few days later, the ship's false keel was damaged. This call was followed by a visit to Grenada, then a stop at St. Vincent, before returning to Antigua for the hurricane season and to repair the damage done during the grounding at Puerto Rico. The commander died of fever in Antigua on the 1st of November 1772. He was replaced by a Captain Charles Thompson. Thompson was another key figure in Bligh's career, and also one that Horatio Nelson was to follow in the footsteps of. After Crescent, Thompson's next command would be Nelson's frigate HMS Boreas, and he also went on to command the Elephant and the Vanguard, two of Nelson's other later commands. Captain Thompson would earn a baronetcy as second in command at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1797, and died in 1799, a Vice Admiral of the Red. Under Captain Thompson, Bligh was to face his first action. In November 1772, Crescent embarked a company of the 31st Regiment to quell a rebellion on the island of St. Vincent. This required an amphibious landing and storming of enemy trenches. The landing was not without risk, and one of the ship's boats overturned with the loss of a petty officer and 3 seamen. Bligh remained on board Crescent until the 23rd of August 1774, when the ship was paid off back in Britain, arriving at Woolwich Dockyard to be laid up. The log and muster book show the West Indies must have seen a number of crew beside Captain Corner departing their lives due to the unhealthy conditions in the island ports. After being paid off, the Crescent never returned to active service and remained laid up in Woolwich until, on the 13th of June 1777, the ship was sold for £805 for use as a prison ship in the River Thames. Her purchaser was no less than one Duncan Campbell, a West India merchant and entrepreneur who would become closely connected with William Bligh. Following the paying off from the Crescent, Bligh once again turned to his father's friend John Henshaw. Bligh must by now have become a very experienced seaman, and I suspect had started learning his cartography skills. He once again joins his former captain from the Hunter, who assigns him aboard his new command, the 8-gun brig-rigged sloop HMS Ranger, on the 2nd of September 1774, initially as an able seaman, and again he assumes the post of midshipman on the 29th of September 1775. The Ranger was an elegant, if somewhat elderly, little ship, ordered back in 1751 and designed by Pearson Locke, who had had a long career as a master shipwright, first at Plymouth and then taking over at Portsmouth in 1755. The Fly-class sloop was one of Locke's last designs, and he handed the plans to Woolwich Dockyard, where the Ranger was built under the control of the yard's master shipwright Adam Hayes. She was Master Hayes' first build at the yard. She cost the grand sum of £2,467, 11 shillings and 9pence to build, and was launched on the 7th of October 1752. John Henshaw was the brig's 7th captain. Her 4th commander had been one Thomas Paisley, who would go on to command HMS Bellerophon, and also to have her as his flagship at the glorious 1st of June in 1794. Admiral Paisley was also a brother-in-law of Peter Hayward, whose family will have come into Bligh's life during his visits to the Isle of Man on board the Hunter. We have Henshaw's log from July 1775 through to the end of his commission. It starts moored in Douglas Harbour in the Isle of Man. It is likely that during this stop in the town that young William first comes across the Beetham family. The ship spends a long period weatherbound in the port before proceeding to Dublin, Milford Haven and back to Plymouth for refitting. Bligh remains on board until the 17th of March 1776, leaving the ship at the same time as his captain in Plymouth. This is likely to have been the last time Bligh saw Henshaw. The Ranger was Henshaw's last command, and he died in 1780. William's career is about to take a significant shift, as for reasons that remain unclear, he finds himself being given a warrant to serve as a ship's master, and on the 20th of March 1776 he signs on board his next ship. This is particularly strange, as none of his sea time has been listed as acting as a master's mate, which would have been the usual route for a senior midshipman being channelled into a career as a warrant officer rather than as a commissioned officer. Bligh must have had a substantial portfolio of charts from his time in the Irish Sea and the Caribbean, and also shown significant skills as a cartographer and navigator, to have been even considered for such an illustrious post when so young. He is about to join one of the most important voyages in the history of discovery. Captain James Cook has agreed to take on the 22-year-old in the role of Master of HMS Resolution. We know that by this time Bligh had become acquainted with the Beetham family on the Isle of Man, who in turn were connected to the West India merchant and entrepreneur Duncan Campbell. The latter was a known associate of Sir Joseph Banks. Could this have been the influence Bligh needed to secure such a plum posting? Or could Captain Thompson, his commander on the Crescent, be the key? Sadly, documentary evidence is slim, but the connection with Sir Joseph Banks was about to be made, a man who would remain a supporter of Bligh's career throughout the rest of his life. The next 3 months would be hectic in preparing the ship that was fitting out at Deptford Dockyard, alongside her accompanying vessel, HMS Discovery. As Bligh now had sufficient sea time to take his examination for lieutenant, and as he was likely to be away for a long voyage, he took time out from the fitting out to apply to the board of the Admiralty. He passed the exam on the 1st of May 1776. However, no immediate commission was granted, and he remains on board Resolution as a non-commissioned warrant officer, albeit the most senior rank of a non-commissioned officer could obtain, in charge of the safe navigation and day-to-day running of the ship. We should say something about Resolution. Already famous from her first voyage around the world, undertaken between 1772 and 1775. She was built in Whitby at Fishburne's Yard back in 1769 and originally named the Marquis of Granby. Of 461 tons burden and 110 feet on deck, she was a ship-rigged merchantman armed with 12 6-pounder guns. Purchased by the Navy for £4,151 back in November 1771, The ship had initially been renamed the Drake. However, so as not to offend the Spanish, she was renamed Resolution. After her return from Cook's second voyage in July 1775, the ship was laid up in the Thames before being recommissioned in February 1776. In June 1776, she completed her refit at Deptford and proceeded to sea, with a last call at Plymouth. The ship left England on the 12th of July, with her accompanying vessel, HMS Discovery, following on 3 weeks later, after Captain Charles Clark was delayed in London. After calling at Tenerife and Cape Town, the two ships sail on to Tasmania, calling at Adventure Bay for wood and water. The next stop was Queen Charlotte Sound in New Zealand, where the ships again refitted for the voyage to Tonga and Tahiti, where Cook was returning Omai, who had travelled back on Resolution to England on the second voyage. Mai was left at Huahine. Cook was to stay nearly 4 months around Polynesia. On the way past, the two ships passed through the Austral Islands, with Bligh carefully charting the island of Tubuai, which was to become a temporary home for the mutineers on the Bounty some years later. Leaving Tahiti on the 7th of December 1777, the ships headed northeast and fell in with the islands of Hawaii in January 1778. Again, much of the surveying around the islands is undertaken by Bligh. Cook named the islands the Sandwich Islands after his patron and sailed on to the American coast, making landfall at Cape Foulweather on the 6th of March. The ships then travelled up the coast to Nootka Sound, where Cook named an island Bligh Island after the ship's sailing master. After this discovery, the two ships proceeded all the way up the coast to the Bering Sea. In May 1778, Bligh was instructed to survey Prince William Sound, initially named Sandwich Sound. A reef was discovered and still bears the name Bligh Reef to this day. It was on this same reef that the oil tanker Exxon Valdez grounded, resulting in one of the most famous oil spills in modern history. The hunt for the Northwest Passage around the Alaska coast was frustrated by heavy ice floes, and the ships needed to reprovision. Cook took the decision to return to the Sandwich Islands. On the return to Hawaii, Bligh once again put his charting skills to good use in drawing charts of Kealakekua Bay. The chart clearly marks the anchoring position of HMS Resolution. We can also trace the final footsteps of Captain Cook, as the enforced return to the bay due to a damage to the ship's foremast after such a promising initial visit descended into violence, following a series of serious thefts of the ship's equipment. Again, over time, historians, including Richard Howe, have wrongly attributed a possible cause for Cook's death to Bligh, when he was actually on the deck of Resolution at the time of the islanders' attack. He watched the events through a telescope. Instead, it was the cowardice of Lieutenant Williamson, who can be largely blamed for not going to his captain's aid, with Cook also showing signs of overconfidence and an increasing tendency towards bouts of bad temper, or heavers, as his men referred to them. These may indeed have been a trait Bligh sought to copy from Cook during his future commands. Bligh's activity earlier in the day had been to blockade canoes from heading out to sea at the far end of the bay. With Captain Charles Clark suffering from tuberculosis, much of the task of running Resolution now fell upon Bligh. John Gore took command of the Discovery, and the ships headed to Kamchatka to refit. The Resolution in particular, was badly leaking, and the wooden hull sheathing had been eaten by teredo worm into a fine honeycomb. As a result, the two ships head to the Russian port of Petropavlovsk in the harsh winter to make repairs. The following summer they headed back to the ice, but were once again thwarted. Upon their return to Kamchatka, Captain Clark died. This necessitated a significant reorganisation of the ship's crew. Bligh was joined by a master's mate from the Discovery, Nathaniel Portlock. He was to be another key figure in Bligh's life, along with James Burney, who joined the ship as a lieutenant. Burney was to be a long-time collaborator with Bligh, and later helped with the editing of Bligh's narrative of the Bounty voyage. The other key figure from the voyage was the artist John Webber, who not only painted a wonderful portrait of Bligh in his master's uniform, but also later painted a portrait of Elizabeth Beethan as a wedding present to the couple. With the two ships in poor condition, they headed for home. En route, they called at Macau and Cape Town, undergoing further periods of extensive repairs. The ship then called at the Orkney Islands, and it was there that Bligh first met with the Stewart family and their young son George Stewart, who would later sail on the Bounty. With the Resolution paid off in Deptford on the 6th of October 1780, completing a voyage that had lasted 4 years, 3 months and 2 days, Bligh then took some leave. His immediate return was not a happy one. Unlike some of his shipmates, including his two master's mates Nathaniel Portlock and Henry Roberts, they received immediate promotion to the rank of lieutenant. No promotion was granted to Bligh. This can largely be blamed on Bligh's poor relationship with Second Lieutenant James King, and possibly also with First Lieutenant John Gore, who were in command of Discovery and Resolution for the return journey. The promotion of Henry Roberts was particularly galling to Bligh, as Roberts took on the task of copying all the charts from the voyage for publication, and failed to attribute credit to Bligh. A further blow occurred with the death of his father, Francis Bligh, who passed away in Plymouth in December 1780. The consolation was that William then headed back to the Isle of Man and was married to the 27-year-old Elizabeth Beethan, or Betsy, as Bligh referred to her. They were married on the 4th of February 1781. Bligh also was awarded an 8th share in the profits from the publication of the official account of Resolution's third voyage. This would earn Bligh over £1,000 by 1801, a considerable sum. However, Bligh's feeling of rancour at his shoddy treatment gives us the first sign of his temperament. The young couple's honeymoon was extremely short, and on the 7th of February, Bligh starts his logbook for his new appointment as master of the 36-gun, 12-pounder frigate Belle-Poule, under the command of Philip Patton. This fine ship had been built in 1766 in Bordeaux as one of 4 Dédéganès-class frigates, to a design by Léon Michel Guinness. Belle-Poule was famous for her action against the British 32-gun frigate Arethusa off Sandy Hook back in the 22nd of July 1778, in which both ships fought themselves to a standstill, with Belle-Poule retreating with far heavier casualties. However, on her next engagement, on the 14th of July 1780, she came up against the 64-gun third-rate of the line Nonsuch, under the command of Captain Sir James Wallace. The ship attempted to escape again, but the heavy metal of Nonsuch's guns tore up the ship. 24 of the crew were killed, including her captain, and 47 were injured. Belpool was purchased into the service and refitted and coppered at Plymouth. The repairs from the battle took several months, with Bligh joining the ship 2 months before work was completed. The cost of the refit was £11,005, 11 shillings and twopence. Both Bligh's and Patton's logbooks detail the tedious work of convoy duty and fleet patrols in the North Sea. However, on the 17th of April 1781, while off Dunstanburgh Castle, en route to Leith in Scotland, in company with the 74-gun HMS Berwick, they sighted a French privateer. A chase ensued, and the Belpool overtook her consort, receiving shot from the Frenchman's stern-chase guns. Belpool then ranged up, firing 3 or 4 broadsides into her quarter. The privateer La Colonne of Dunkirk, under the command of Luc Rayon, had 32 guns and was a useful prize, and the captured ship was carried into Leith, giving Bligh his first taste of prize money. In a pattern that would repeat itself, Bligh's account of the action is significantly more detailed than that of the captain. He talks of the value of the brig the Cologne had captured the previous night, worth 300 guineas, and how the French captain had mistaken the Berwick for a merchantman. The next major excitement came on the 5th of August 1781, when Belpool was stationed with the North Sea Fleet under Admiral Hyde Parker, off Dogger Bank. Once again, we can see the account of Bligh. He writes, "The enemy fleet appeared to be about 13 sail of man-of-war and 1 large cutter. There were 6 or 7 two-deckers from 74 to 40 guns, and others were lofty large frigates. There were about 60 to 70 sail of merchant vessels. Some had the appearance of mounting guns. The enemy's line was formed on the larboard tack to leeward. Our squadron led in a line of battle ahead for the rear of the enemy and handed the wind in their stations. Admiral Parker gave the signal for engaging when the Dutch admiral appeared to give the first fire. Admiral Parker commanded 7 ships of the line and 5 frigates, including Belpool, and the engagement was fierce. While the Dutch fleet suffered heavier casualties and the loss of a ship of the line, the Holland, which sank during the action, the poor condition of the British ships led to their withdrawal, and hence both sides claimed victory. Both convoys of merchantmen escaped unharmed. The sole honour from the battle from the British side was achieved by the Belpool in retrieving the Admiral's colours from the sunken Holland. Bligh writes of the recovery. "Found a Dutch line of battle sunk in 22 fathoms, her mastheads out of the water and pennant flying, which we took away and stood towards the Admiral." The handing of the flag to the Admiral may have been one of the final pointers needed to ensure Bligh's promotion, which finally came on the 5th of September 1781, when the Belpool was at the Nore. The ship was reportedly in a bad condition by now, with a surveyor from the Navy Board declaring the ship unfit for sea, and the last day of Bligh's logbook records the vessel being moved into Sheerness Harbour. The ship's muster book reports that Bligh was discharged to the Berwick on preferment. The Belpool was to remain laid up at Chatham until 1796, when she was refitted as a receiving ship in the Medway. She remained in this role until September 1801, when she was sold to a Mr. Bailey and broken up. On the 7th of September 1781, Acting 5th Lieutenant William Bligh reports aboard the flagship the Berwick. The logbook records, "Fresh breezes and clear. Set up ye rigging fore and aft. Came aboard 3 pilots. Received on board sundry stores. Came aboard Mr. Bligh, acting lieutenant." Admiral Parker had handed over command of the fleet to Commodore Keith Stewart, who was a distant relative of Bligh's wife Elizabeth, and if George Macinnes is to be believed, a former friend of Bligh's father. It was to the new Commodore that William finally owes his promotion, as well as to his wife's and her uncle's Duncan Campbell's persistence. The latter was fast turning out to be Bligh's key patron. The 74-gun third-rate HMS Berwick had been built at Portsmouth Dockyard between 1769 and 1775 to designs by Sir John Hensley. She was one of 6 Elizabeth-class ships, armed with 28 32-pound long guns on her lower deck and 28 18-pounders on her upper deck, with 18 9-pounders on the forecastle and quarterdeck. With 1,622 tons burden and a length of gun deck of 168 feet 6 inches, she was a fine ship. The ship had cost £30,774, 11 shillings and 5 pence to build, with a further £14,013, 2 shillings and 4 pence in fitting out costs and coppering. Just before the commission, in February 1781, she had been refitted at Plymouth Dockyard at a cost of a further £9,194, 16 shillings and 8 pence. The Berwick was a veteran of the First Battle of Ushant in 1778 and had been at the centre of the fighting at the Battle of Dogger Bank. Later in her career, in 1795, she was captured by 3 French frigates in the Mediterranean. However, she was recaptured off Cape Trafalgar in October 1805, only to be wrecked the day after the battle in the great storm that followed the famous victory. Bligh's time on board the Berwick must have been very dull. The Dutch fleet dared not venture out again, and the fleet sat idle at the Nore anchorage or patrolling off the Dutch coast. This must have been a nervous time for Bligh, as Betsy was to give birth to their first daughter, Harriet, up in Leith on the 15th of November 1781, whilst Bligh was stuck on the idle ship moored in the Downs. Bligh left the Berwick on the 1st of January 1782, as he is transferred to the slightly larger Princess Amelia. Princess Amelia was a slightly unusual one-off 80-gun three-decker that had been launched in 1757 in Woolwich Dockyard to a design by Joseph Allen, who had also designed Commodore Anson's HMS Centurion, in which he circumnavigated the globe back in 1745. Princess Amelia had originally cost £45,062, a significant sum compared to the better sailing Berwick. Her last major refit had been a middling repair back in 1765, and her last minor refit had taken place 18 months before the Battle of Dogger Bank. However, once again, Bligh's on board was limited to short cruises in the Channel and North Sea. This included visits to Bligh's childhood home in Plymouth in February 1782. On the 19th of March, Captain Billy Douglas's log records part of the ship's company was discharged and ordered into Ye Cambridge, per order of the Admiralty. Bligh was once again one of those leaving the ship. Before we move on, we should say something about Captain Billy Douglas. He was promoted commander in 1778. He held 2 small commands, a brig and a 14-gun sloop, HMS Fly, before being posted to the rank of captain in August 1781. The Amelia was therefore his first ship of the line, and he had succeeded her previous captain, John Macartney, who had been killed at the Battle of Dogger Bank. After the end of the Amelia's commission in July 1782, he would, like most sea officers, spend until March 1794 on the beach, unemployed. He then took part in the capture of Cape Town in 1795 in command of the 64-gun ship HMS Stately. Billy Douglas would be promoted to the rank of full Admiral in December 1813, and he died the same month as Bligh, on the 2nd of December 1817. Moving to Cambridge, she was like Amelia, a 3-decked 80-gun ship, and had been designed by Joseph Allen. We have this wonderful painting of the ship being launched at Deptford Dockyard back in October 1755. She had cost £43,974, 10 shillings and threepence, with original fitting out costs of an additional £3,351, 10 shillings and twopence. Her early career was spent in the Caribbean, and you see the ship here during the bombardment of Havana in 1762. Her captain during the fitting out at Plymouth Dockyard was John Holloway. The ship was just completing this major refit when Bligh joined in March 1782, which the Admiralty records show cost £27,493, 7 shillings and 10pence. Bligh was writing letters to Duncan Campbell by this time. One letter complains about the slow progress of the work at the dockyard. Bligh's impatience and finding fault for poor work standards was already becoming clear as the Revolutionary War drew to its unsatisfactory close. It was also borne out of the frustration of Admiral Sir Samuel Barrington's squadron, to which the Cambridge was assigned, capturing a convoy of 13 merchantmen in the Bay of Biscay, and the great prize money that this could have entailed had the ship been part of the fleet. Some accounts indicate that also joining the ship at the same time was a 17-year-old ship's boy named Fletcher Christian. His name at this time is greatly at odds with his lowly position on board, and checks of the ship's muster book reveal no mention of Christian's name. Only Bligh's entry can be seen as 6th Lieutenant. This is therefore yet another error that has crept into the tale through careless research. The connection between these two names will therefore have to wait a while longer. On the 22nd of June, Bligh's patron, Keith Stewart, rejoined the ship in Portsmouth Harbour, with final stores being taken on board for service in the Channel Fleet. In July, the Cambridge, together with Lord Howe's fleet, sighted 33 enemy ships of the line and 5 frigates. Howe failed to bring the fleet into action, wanting to keep his fleet together due to the superior size of the enemy fleet. This further disappointment was followed by the great loss of Rear Admiral Richard Kempenfeldt's flagship, the 100-gun first-rate Royal George, whilst the fleet was waiting in Spithead anchorage. The ship capsized and sank while repair work was underway on her underwater hull to get at a leak, whilst heeled over at anchor on the 29th of August 1782. It is believed that poor quality bolts and rotten timber on the opposite side parted, and a whole section of the ship's bottom fell out. The ship capsized and sank very quickly, with the loss of nearly 900 men, women and children, including the famous Admiral. Many ships, including the Cambridge, sent ship's boats to rescue survivors, and Bligh is likely to have been involved. It wasn't until the 12th of September that the fleet once again proceeded to sea with significant force. Lord Howe was sailing in HMS Victory with 32 ships of the line and 12 frigates escorting a convoy of 102 merchantmen, bound for the relief of Gibraltar. This convoy had increased to a total of 176 ships in company by the 14th of September. The management of such a huge fleet of sailing ships, all with different sailing qualities, was difficult, with the slow speed of the fleet also hampered by poor weather. The approach to Gibraltar went well, but the fleet of merchantmen misjudged the tides in the straits and was swept past Gibraltar. However, they all beat back the next day, with Howe's ships of the line successfully screening the merchantmen from the Spanish and French fleet. With all the merchantmen safely berthed in Gibraltar, Howe sought out the combined fleet and on the 20th of October, action was joined between the two great fleets. The Allied fleet fielded 45 ships of the line against Howe's 32 ships. The log of Cambridge records a fierce action in the evening, commencing at 5:30 p.m, with Cambridge joining the fight at 6 p.m. However, at 10:30 at night, the Allied fleet withdrew. Cambridge's log records 3 men killed and 7 wounded, with 2 guns dismounted, and the sails and rigging were damaged. The quarterdeck and poop received shot, with the ship's binnacle being smashed and the stern lanterns destroyed. Howe retired back to Plymouth, and Bligh and the Cambridge were to remain at anchor for the rest of the year. With peace signed in January 1783, Bligh was paid off, with the Cambridge being placed into ordinary and paid off in April. The ship was to spend the next few months being refitted for service in the Caribbean before being converted into a receiving ship and guard ship in Plymouth for the duration of the French Revolutionary Wars. Her last commission was to be in 1801 as flagship for another figure closely connected to the Bligh story, Vice Admiral Sir Thomas Pasley. The ship was finally sold and broken up in 1808. After leaving the Cambridge, Bligh's financial situation was not good, and he returned to his wife in Douglas, the Isle of Man. Duncan Campbell offered him employment in the merchant service, and on the 4th of June 1783 grants Bligh a £40 advance on his future salary. However, it took until July to receive permission from the Admiralty, and on the 12th of September we see his appointment as commander of the 350-ton West Indiaman, the Lynx. This ship operated on the London to Jamaica trade and was to load coal in Newcastle for a voyage out to the islands. The ship had been first built in Blackwall in 1778 and had been purchased initially as a sloop of war by the Navy. However, Campbell had purchased her in 1782 from the Navy and had her copper sheathed. The vessel had 3 full decks as well as a hold for cargo storage, and was classed at Lloyd's of London as of A1 condition. Campbell had paid the Admiralty £2,200 for the ship. We should say a bit more about Duncan Campbell. Born in 1726 and educated at Glasgow University, after a short career in the Royal Navy, he had become a successful merchant in the West Indies. He married Rebecca, the daughter of Dugald Campbell of Salt Springs in Jamaica in 1753, and through her family acquired substantial property. Duncan's sister had married Richard Beethan, Elizabeth Bligh's father. In 1776, Duncan Campbell had been appointed the first superintendent of prison hulks off Woolwich, a post which blossomed with the ending of the transportation to the American colonies after the end of the American War of Independence. At the same time, Campbell operated a substantial fleet of merchant ships. These struggled with the fluctuations of the freight market, and the loss of his trade in transporting convicts to Virginia in 1777, a partnership he had as a joint venture with the merchant John Stewart. This loss created regular cash flow issues. In 1782 alone, Campbell faced a loss of £4,000 during the year from his shipping activities, with the loss of his ship Orange Bay in a hurricane while at anchor off Port Royal, and the capture of his vessel the Salt Spring, proving major problems to his shipping investment portfolio. Through his connections with Joseph Banks and the West India merchants, Campbell was a strong lobbyist for the introduction of the Botany Bay convict colony. He was also one of the lobbyists of the King that ensured that the bounty voyage to collect breadfruit was undertaken, as you see here in a letter to his son Dugald, who ran the Jamaican end of the family business, he also appears to take credit for gaining Bligh his position as commander of the Bounty. Bligh was joined on the links by Campbell's son John, who Campbell noted seemed to have benefited from his tutelage in navigation and to have treated him kindly. On the 1st of April 1784, little Harriet was joined by a sister, Mary, who was baptised in Douglas, where Elizabeth Bligh was staying with her family. Soon after this, Bligh rented a house at 4 Broad Street in St George's in the East End of London. It was here that his third daughter Elizabeth was born in March 1786. Sadly, the house no longer exists, having been cleared for construction of one of the London dock basins in the early 19th century. However, it was likely to have been similar to this. Bligh was still recorded by Lloyd's Register to be in command of the Lynx in 1786. Owen Rutter makes mention of Bligh shifting from the Lynx to a ship called the Cambrian in 1785. However, there is no instruction letters included in Campbell's letter book for his command of that vessel. We certainly have instructions dated the 1st of October 1784 showing him to proceed to Green Island in the Lynx, sailing in company with the Britannia. Times in shipping were hard, with money scarce in the West Indies due to the effects of a series of hurricanes damaging the sugar crops, and as a result both ships were travelling out to the islands in ballast. Letters with Campbell, dated 18th of November 1786, show Bligh's appointment to take command of Campbell's newest vessel, the Britannia. She was a 460-ton, 3-decked West Indiaman, built on the River Thames in 1782. Like the Lynx, she had been coppered during 1782. It is during this voyage that Fletcher Christian joins him as a volunteer to gain experience, with Mr. Edward Lamb acting as Bligh's first mate. Letters included in Bligh's pamphlet titled Answers to Certain Assertions, written in response to Edward Christian's publication of the mutineers' court-martial minutes and its attachment of his own notes from interviews with the Bounty crew, explained his experience of working with Fletcher Christian. Edward Lamb details that Christian was signed aboard the Britannia not as second mate, but as the gunner, although he was requested to be treated as an officer by Bligh. What is clear from Lamb's letter and from the accounts of the sailmaker Lawrence Lebogue is that the two men had become close friends. They were dining together every other day, and Bligh, as he had done with Duncan Campbell's son John, spent time teaching Christian navigation and drawing. Bligh's salary at this time was around £600 per year, far above a lieutenant's pay of just £73 per day in the Navy, and half that if he had been on half pay. On Britannia, he completed 2 voyages to the West Indies, returning to England on the 5th of August 1787 to find a letter from Sir Joseph Banks waiting for him. A new command and a return to the Royal Navy awaits. This well-known story will be the subject of our next tale. However, before we do so, it is very interesting to note that Duncan Campbell not only appears to have been pushing Joseph Banks and the Admiralty to take Bligh as the mission commander to transport the breadfruit from Tahiti to the West Indies, but also to have been pushing the Admiralty to accept Bligh's former command, the Lynx, as the most suitable candidate for the voyage. Times were very hard in the merchant shipping market at this time, and both the Lynx and the ship eventually chosen for the role, the small 230-ton merchantman the Bethia, were laid up at the time without employment. You see here the letter written to the Admiralty offering links for sale for £2,200. This letter offers a tantalising what-if. The larger sloop could have justified the post of master and commander, and offered far more space for both plants and crew, both significant factors that impacted the eventual voyage. However, Duncan Campbell did, it seemed, succeed in his choice of leader for this expedition. I do hope you will join me for our next instalment soon, which will follow the exciting events of the two Breadfruit voyages. Thanks for listening.